The Address Mental Health Lab at the University of Oregon presents the Culturally Adapting Mental Health Care Interview Series, supported by the Varda Shoham Clinical Science Training Initiative from the Society for a Science of Clinical Psychology.
Okay, so I believe the recording has started now. Perfect. So welcome everyone. I'm Clarissa Velez, and I'm a graduate student in the Clinical Psychology PhD program at the University of Oregon. I'm here today with Dr. Shawn Jones, who is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for giving us your time today so that we can have this discussion.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
Wonderful. So I'm meeting with Dr. Jones as part of a series that's supported by the Society for a Science of Clinical Psychology, Varda Shoham Clinical Science Training Initiative. The goal of our series is to help scientist practitioners understand cultural resilience factors, cultural risk factors, and minority stressors for ethnic, racial, minoritized clients, as well as how we can culturally adapt mental health interventions given all of these factors. I'm looking forward to learning more from Dr. Jones today. Thank you again, Dr. Jones.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, to get us started, what are some common cultural resilience factors for Black youth clients?
Absolutely. It's a great question. Glad you asked. So, when I think about the common cultural resilience factors for Black youth, there are really three in particular that come to mind, and that my research and my colleagues' scholarship and those who have come before us have really sought to pinpoint and address. So the first that I'll actually talk about them developmentally. So the first is racial or ethnic racial socialization. And so a number of scholars have sought to kind of codify or define what that means. For the purposes of brevity, I'll just define it as a family level process by which parents and caregivers of Black youth, in this instance, relay messages about the meaning and significance of race and culture to their youth. And so, what we know about ethnic racial socialization as a resilience factor is that both the content of racial socialization messaging, as well as processes connected to what we call racial socialization competency, are really important. The content concerns the messages. What do parents say? Are the messages promoting pride? Are they preparing youth to navigate racism or bias? Are they promoting egalitarianism? Are they behavioral in nature, like taking youth to a Black History Month museum or cooking culturally congruent foods? That's the content. The competency, which is a relatively newer way in which we're looking at racial socialization, really concerns the parents and caregiver system. How prepared and confident and stressed are parents as they think about embarking on the work of teaching their youth how to navigate their racialized world? And so, what we know in our research is that the extent to which um, Black youth and caregivers feel prepared, feel that they have the skills, the confidence, they feel competent, they feel, reasonably or appropriately stressed, not super stressed at the
Right.
prospect of conversations, the better that youth are doing with regard to internalizing, externalizing symptoms, and the better that parents feel as well about their racial socialization self-efficacy or their ability to have these conversations. So that's one. Um, the second resilience factor that I think about developmentally is racial identity. One of the things that we know is that in addition to being associated, with things like self-esteem and things like academic motivation and even grade point average, lower depressive symptoms. We also know that racial socialization is also a key ingredient in the development of a healthy racial or ethnic racial identity. I'm going to use Robert Sellers and colleagues' conceptualization of that as it sounds familiar to what I just said, the significance and meaning that an individual ascribes to their race and culture. And so we also know that both as a promotive factor And as a protective factor, racial identity is really salient and important for many Black youth clients. So helping them to feel a sense of self-identity connected to collective identity that also helps them to navigate what I'm sure you'll ask me about moving forward, which is some of the racially relevant risk and stressors that I know we'll talk about. So racial identity is super important. And then the third and final, I think it's a little bit less discussed in
Mhm.
the youth literature is going to be kind of a cultural orientation in the context of Black youth. Sometimes we refer to that as an Afro or Afrocentric worldview. This is just, when we think about often, think about like Psych 101, when you think about individualistic, collectivistic culture and worldview,
Right.
right? So how much are youth taught to embrace things like verve and rhythm and a flexible time orientation, key kind of attributes of a more Afrocentric relative to maybe a more Eurocentric orientation, and noting the extent to which that is also supportive of, again, youth sense of self. And their ability to navigate successfully with, and stress and coping processes. So again, socialization, identity, and worldview are three really critical cultural resilience factors for Black youth clients.
What a beautiful explanation. Thank you so much for breaking that down for our audience. And so you did a great job summarizing them at the end, but just so that we can be cohesive throughout the whole thing, I heard ethnic racial socialization, a sense of racial identity, and then also this cultural orientation, which specifically for Black youth is this Afrocentric worldview in comparison to
Mhm.
like a Eurocentric worldview.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
so, how can trainees kind of incorporate these three cultural risk resilience factors that you were talking about into their treatment with Black youth?
Yeah, absolutely. Another great question. Have been, really fortunate to write a bit about this. So I
Yeah.
really think about it in a couple of different ways. So, um, and I share this with the trainees here.
Hmm.
So you can think about assessment, and then you can also think about more kind of maybe intervention,
Intervention.
psychotherapy,
Yeah.
that,
Hmm.
right? So assessment, I'm not necessarily talking about, assessment with a capital A. I'm not talking about waste and those sorts of measures, but certainly there are a bevy of measures that exist that scholars who have come before me have put in painstaking amount of time in
Hmm.
refining and getting the psychometric properties to really strong places that allow trainees, allow clinicians to understand at any given moment in time the extent to which Black youth are reporting that they're receiving racial socialization messages, that parents are documenting that they're providing racial socialization messages. My colleagues and I recently created a multi-ethnic version of the racial socialization competency scale, which allows any parent, no matter their racial ethnic background, to speak to and highlight the extent to which they feel confident, skillful, and stressed at the
Right.
prospect of racial socialization. There are youth measures that exist for assessing um, ethnic racial identity, as well as more so for teens, but there are
Hmm.
some teen-focused measures of an Afrocentric worldview. And so, one of the things that I would say to trainees is, as a part of just a multicultural orientation and your curiosity and your cultural humility, engaging or considering leveraging or integrating those sorts of measures into your standard intake processes,
Right.
right? So at the same time that we might be doing, some sort of other, measure of, wellness or functioning, be it Connors, or if we're
Hmm.
assessing some sort of, internalizing symptoms, why not, potentially consider adding a maybe teen or youth, or adding some of Diane Hughes's child socialization scales into the mix as a way to get a understanding for how salient those factors are, excuse me, as well as in the same way that we follow process, we understand that particularly for youth, identity is dynamic.
Yeah.
We also understand that the provision and competency of racial socialization also varies across time
Mhm.
and some of our work. So it also not only provides a nice opportunity to understand a client more robustly at the outset, but there are also opportunities, even looking at some of the test retest reliability work that we're doing now, to follow up with clients at, maybe the beginning versus the end of treatment and seeing if there, are differences or improvements in how one feels about themselves and the messages that they are providing or receiving, etc. So
Right.
I would say that that is the assessment piece that I would recommend for trainees,
Mhm.
that I think looms large. The other really concerns what, great scholars like my colleagues, Dr. Rihanna Anderson, Dr. Aisha Metzger, and others are doing over recent years. The good folks at UNC Greensboro, University of Texas, Gabby Stein and Stephanie Cord, they have done really great work around developing um, interventions really right around that leverage or integrate racial socialization techniques. Adriana Umanya Taylor has also developed a great classroom-based racial identity intervention. And so there are also opportunities to glean and pull right maybe modules or aspects of some of those existing interventions into the therapeutic room, right? So not necessarily needing to do a full on, manualized step out or walk out,
Mhm.
but can we maybe borrow a module from Engaging, Managing, and Bonding Through Race, the Embrace program from Dr. Anderson, and or use some of the skills in the context of um, trauma-focused CBT that Dr. Metzger
Yeah.
has done in her work, leveraging the practice skills from TFCBT and integrating
Right.
racial socialization. So I think there are really neat opportunities to pull in some of those interventional techniques that seek to boost or bolster self-efficacy,
Mhm.
improve a healthy sense of self that clinicians can also borrow from and fold into their existing kind of therapeutic work as well.
That was an amazing breakdown. And I also just appreciate you listing the names of like the authors and the scientists who are doing this work with you because it gives our audience kind of an opportunity to look into those folks and their expertise as well. And so, just for the audience to summarize, um, there are kind of assessment measures that allow you to track these strengths-based experiences that Black youth are having alongside other things that maybe like internalized symptoms that we would more traditionally assess for.
Mhm.
And because these experiences for youth are dynamic in nature and change over time, it would be important for a clinician to be considering those things
Mhm.
throughout treatment. And then there's also these interventions that a bunch of wonderful scientists have created. And you're talking about like looking into all of that work and seeing, even from like a modularized perspective, right, how we
Mhm.
can integrate these things into our specific clients' cases.
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
love that so much. Thank you. And so, what are some common cultural risk factors for Black youth clients? I know when you were talking about racial identity, you said that this might be something that you're going to pull back in again, or if there's another place you want to start as well, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I think about your first question or first kind of couplet of questions
Right.
in terms of cultural resilience factors, we often think about, the answer to me always is like resilient to what or resilient
Mhm.
why. And so, when I think about, whether we think about, the pioneering work of Margaret Bill Spencer, and we think about a model like P-Vest, which is a more culturally nuanced take on Bronfman Brenner, ecological systems theory. We are always thinking about the interplay between risk and resilience, right? Vulnerability and strength, right? And so when I think about, okay, well, why are racial socialization, racial identity, and cultural orientation, Afrocentric worldview, why are those critical? Well, they're critical largely because a primary and pernicious cultural risk factor for Black youth are, the at least we'll call it at least tripartite unfolding of racism and racism related stress.
Right.
And when I say tripartite, what I'm talking about is that the existence of racism at individual, institutional, and cultural intersecting points, as another brilliant Dr. James Jones highlights in their seminal work. Racism and prejudice. And so, um, really, I mean, I could talk about a number of other risk factors, but for me, just honestly, um, I think it all at the end of the day stems back to racism in its multiple forms.
Right.
And so I think that is really a key risk factor from which other things emanate. If you if those in our um, listening or watching or reading transcripts of this or sections of this.
Right.
If you're familiar also, with Cynthia Garcia Cole's integrative model, it highlights a very, telling way in which we start with, you know, how, race, this social construct, connects to, structures and systems of racism. And then when we start thinking about the things I could list off, like, Black youth being overrepresented in, foster care system or poverty or other risk factors, a lot of those things we could argue emanate right from racism. So I'm often thinking about, okay, what are the individual ways in which racism show up for Black youth? One example that I can pull, are thinking about the ways in our digital age, for example, and shouting out the work of Brandisha Tynes and Henry Willis, who have looked at online racial victimization, online name calling, bullying that is racialized in
Right.
nature. Those are some of the ways that youth today are navigating maybe, being called, dark, or their hair texture or their skin tone, or their intelligence being, talked about or insulted and shared around, platforms like TikTok or Snapchat or what have you that youth are engaging with. When I think about institutional racism in those intersections for youth, I think about, for example, a case in Texas, and I'm at the moment, unfortunately, blanking on the young man's name, but there's a young man who had been throughout his later high school years in a gridlock fight for the fact that he was suspended from school for wearing his hair in a locked
Yeah.
fashion.
Yeah.
And they spoke to, right, in this particular case, like, well, this is the policy. And so when I think about institutional forms of racism as a risk factor, I think about, okay, well, what are the ways in which it's just the policy impacts or denigrates Black youth? We think about that in a lot of the systems for youth in particular. So I think about a lot of institutional policies at the level of schools that we
Right.
hear across the country, at the level of, I've often presented some very harrowing research that came out of Yale about the overrepresentation um, of restraints being used when Black youth report into emergency settings with mental and psychiatric crises, right? And so, how do we understand how policies are showing up in disparate treatment of youth, like being strapped and restrained down, which is
Right.
right? And so, and then I think about cultural, right? I think about what are the broader ways in which Black youth are depicted in popular culture and mass media,
Yeah.
the comparisons and contrasting of kind of the villainization of Black youth. There is great research that talks about how, from even a cultural standpoint, Black youth are often talked about in news outlets as being larger and bigger and older than they are in reality, right? And so when we think about all of those factors, how are they spilling into the ecological settings that you find themselves, again, school settings, neighborhood settings, etc. And so that is what I would argue. Sorry, very long-winded, but that is what I would argue is the most pernicious kind of cultural risk factor, and really stressor as well. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so hope that's
Yeah,
helpful.
I mean, as long-winded as it was, I think it was necessary, right, for the audience to. And the next question is, how can trainees address these
Yeah,
cultural risk factors in treatment? And I want you to be able to add to that as much as you
yeah,
want. But I think
yeah,
that what I'm hearing from you right now is really the key underlying foundation of addressing these things in treatment is making sure that you are contextualizing your Black youth within like their individual experiences of
yeah,
racism, but also the systems in which they have to navigate daily and
yeah,
how those policies or rules or even like social norms within those systems can be enacting racist, you know, interactions for
yeah,
them. And then culturally, larger societal messages that youth may be, potentially internalizing
that's
or,
great.
seeing and how that can be influencing the youth that you're working with as well. Is there anything else, just so that like our audience can see that these two were kind
Yeah.
of addressed together, that you would
Yeah.
like to add to that question?
Yeah, no, that's really fantastic. I would just, really emphasize two things. One is, yeah, I love what you said about the balance between understanding folks in their individual context that
Mm-hmm.
that I am, Shawn, right? Who is, a black man. And the intersections. I'm so sorry. Give
No,
me
you're
one.
totally fine.
Sorry about that. I have a
You are
second monitor and it
good.
just had a phantom turn on moment. So that's very random. So yeah, right. I'm Shawn, and I'm a black man. I'm a clinical psychologist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And understanding my individual realities, but also those intersectional realities as well. And
Right.
so I think that's really important for trainees is to not come in with like we might call it race essentialism, this idea that, oops, okay, I have a black child in front of me, and so that means they must have been exposed to X, Y,
100%.
and Z. Remaining curious, and though not discounting, like, well, this is just Shawn, and like the racial
Right.
stuff doesn't matter. I think that's a really delicate balance I talk with trainees
Mm-hmm.
about. That's important, for sure. And then I think the other part that you said, and I didn't talk about it in the kind of tripartite model of thinking about racism. But the other part is whether we want to call it internalized or whether what we want to call what I really like to appropriated racial oppression. So understanding that for trainees to understand that the youth that you may be seeing when you see disinterest or you see attitude or you see willfulness or you see ambivalence, checking to see like maybe is there any maybe appropriated racial oppression, like are there ways in which these youth may have internalized negative stereotypes or
Right.
messages about the deficit related messages that they may have received or heard, and is there any actual internalizing? So in the same ways that we might think about someone with a depressogenic worldview or a pessimistic
Mm-hmm.
worldview, I think it's also important to think about, are our youth perhaps carrying some of the wounds and burdens of denigration and of stereotyping that have been placed on them, and saying, well, I guess this might be true about me. And then
Right.
how do we as clinicians maybe disrupt some of that?
Yeah, that's such a beautiful way of framing it. Thank you for that. I think we did touch on this a little bit, but just want to make sure that you can address it. As much as you would like. What are common minority stressors for Black youth clients? And we did talk about, experiences of racism already.
Mhm.
If you want to add to that, you can. But I think we are also beginning to talk about like signs and symptoms of like
Yeah,
race-based stress and
yeah,
appropriated racial oppression within these youth.
yeah.
So if you want to talk a little bit more about that, that would be fantastic.
Sure, absolutely. So I could touch a little bit on a couple of those too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, one of the other things I would say about kind of, stressors that I think, in particularly in youth clients, that sometimes we see that I think are sequelae again of
Right.
this kind of hierarchy or system and structure of racism is things like stereotype threat. So again, the things like, youth showing up and either feeling fatigued or exhausted or stressed out at either having to like code switch or feel like they have to stay in a particular way because they don't want to be stereotyped or they're
Right.
considered acting white, or so there are these stressors that come out for youth in particular when we think about the intersection of everything I've been talking about with development, where we're also thinking about from an Ericksonian psychosocial perspective, we're thinking about things, right? Like identity being such a pivotal part of the adolescent years, for example, even before the adolescent years, right? We're also thinking about industry. So these ideas of like, what am I good at? Who am I? And those things being filtered through prisms of what have I been told about can create stress that comes out in things again like stereotype threat, feeling like, oh gosh, I don't want to confirm these stereotypes about my blackness. So I don't do this or I don't talk about that or I
Right.
depending on what settings I'm in. And so really thinking about how those stressors show up, I would say for sure. The signs and symptoms piece is a great question as well, right? And so I think, one of the things that I think is so both beautiful and also challenging about kind of our diagnostic system is that, we go through something like the DSM, and you see these symptom sets, and then you see often these caveats that say, no, in youth, it may look different. It may look like this. So, right, I think it's important for trainees to recognize that, yes, if we think about things like Robert Carter's or Tim O'Brien, they both have talked about in different and separate spaces about what does race-based traumatic stress look like. And they talk about in some way, Monica Williams as well, they talk in some ways about how it can mirror some of the same symptoms that you might expect to see with PTSD. So either avoidance or hypervigilance, thinking like, oh, what are you talking about? What are you saying about me? Right? Re-experiencing. So you certainly could see some of those signs and symptoms as youth are navigating the politics and polemics of racism.
Right.
But I think the other thing that I think about is like, oh, and it can also look like attitude, right? It can
Wow.
also look like behavioral disruption. I can't tell you when I was in Philadelphia on postdoc, I would interface with clients who were getting referred for behavioral disruption. And it was, and sometimes it was, this idea of like, well, this is what people already think about me as a black
Yeah.
teenager, a black teenage boy. So I'm gonna give them what they think I am. Or it was like literally folks who were like resisting, being talked down to or feeling like, their blackness was being denigrated. And so how do we also not just think about the classic symptoms that we might expect to see with racial fatigue, like PTSD sort of symptoms, but how do we also think about when we see either the very withdrawn youth or oftentimes because just that's how the data bear out, you
Right.
often see youth refer with a behavioral concern and really kind of scratching below the surface to see if maybe some of this are actually reactions to the racial stress and trauma that they're contending with.
Right. Right. And yeah, that's just so beautifully said. Thank you for that. Just thinking about um not only contextualizing the systems, but also contextualizing the amount of, for lack of a better word, like cognitive and emotional load
Mm.
um
Hmm.
that youth need to be navigating and juggling throughout their lives, just to stay well, right?
Hmm.
How you can
Hmm.
intervene in a way that reduces that load for them.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Absolutely. And it's so great. And like even just thinking about, we often write about this, my colleagues and I, like Black youth are youth. And so
yeah,
they're still contending with all the other things that youth are contending with, right? And then
right.
we've said, oh, let's take this social construct and like layer this stress on top of you, in addition to the other stresses with pubertal timing and like all the other things that are identity that is general in nature, right?
Right.
That's why racial identity is interesting. How salient is this to me as a part of me answering the question of who I am and who others perceive me
100%.
to be? So I think, yeah, as clinicians, really seeing our youth and understanding them in developmental as well as like social, societal developmental
Right.
context is really key.
And approaching that with curiosity and
Absolutely.
rather than, assuming that just because you've read this literature, it applies to the person in front of you.
Beautifully said, as you have been saying. Beautifully said. Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
you so much. I'm enjoying this conversation so much. Is there anything else you'd like to add about how trainees can address these stressors in treatment?
Yeah, the last thing that I'll say
Mhm.
here is that for a number of years here at VCU, I have talked with our third year clinical trainees, our trainees, and we've talked a lot about initially, obviously moving away from cultural competence, cultural humility. But
Right.
we've also really been, digging, more recently coming out of counseling psychology, notions of like multicultural orientation. And
Mhm.
one of the things that they talk about in MCO is the notion of um, cultural opportunities or moments. And so what I would say it's not a specific intervention, it's
Right.
more so like an ethos and approach. So I think just as important as curiosity is courage. And we know that there's literature that suggests that parents, that clinicians often shy away from talking about the impact of race and racism because they
Mhm.
don't think youth are ready, and they overshoot that. They
Yep.
actually think that youth's first conversation to have to talk about race and the significance of it is way older than youth are actually ready to receive.
Experiencing that,
So
right?
I would encourage curiosity and courage, and obviously if maybe don't have the same lived experiences, if your these look different than the Black clients that you're working from, that's okay,
Yep.
right? I think working from a space of humility, curiosity, and courage to not shy away from the conversations, because the reality is, like, as my colleague Devin English published a couple of years ago, Black youth are experiencing an average of 5 discriminatory experiences a day. So whether or not we want to talk about it or not, Black youth are still experiencing those things. And so we have to have the courage to also not shy away from putting the onus on them to say, yeah, I'm being discriminated against, but to
Right.
remain curious and courageous to say, hey, might not be salient. But I do want to open up. I want to provide a cultural opportunity, a moment here for us to talk about whether or not this is salient for you. If it's not salient, cool. Let's go back to talking
Mhm.
about other things that are challenging you or going on in your life. But I'm going to hold space intentionally to give you the opportunity to bring that in.
Yeah, yeah. That was so beautifully said. Thank you for ending on that note. Before we end our interview, is there anything else that you would like to share?
Yeah, I would just, I mean, just thank you for the opportunity.
Of course, thank you for saying yes.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I would also just say, I think that we, um, in our clinic, in clinical realms, I think there's a lot of that we can yet do in supporting youth. I know a lot of the answers that I've provided in response to your questions have focused on what trainees can do. And this may be
Right.
you can mute me if I'm wrong. But I also want to note that, like, I also want to encourage any trainee who's watching this that also there is onus on our programs and our
Yeah.
training directors to also make sure that the proverbial like ground is fertile for us to be able to grow and learn these things. Because if we
Yeah.
aren't getting exposed, like, and in my program, which I won't call out, like we weren't necessarily like it wasn't necessarily embedded in all the things that we did, right? And so I do want to say, like, for trainees, continue to encourage that these conversations are happening of how you treat and work across different intersecting identities. I think that's really important. And then for our those of us with more power, and I'm speaking to myself, right? as someone who is a supervisor of a clinic at my own program, like thinking about ways in which I can make it easier for trainees than it was for me to like get access to these measures that we talked about, to get access to these interventions and these protocols and these modular treatments, to find folks who are competent to treat, sorry, not treat, but to train or teach around them. So I would just say like stay encouraged, and also like knowing that those for our trainees, knowing that those who are in positions of relatively more power are also needing to do the work and respond to making sure that we're supporting the holistic well-being of Black youth.
Right. Right. I mean, we can do as much as we can as individuals, but the ecological systems,
Absolutely.
they're relevant to us too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much again. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thank you for watching this interview. Please complete the brief feedback survey linked in the video description below.